Hello, and welcome back to part 4 of a run-through of Parade's End. Now, we've done 3 out of 5 episodes, as shown on the HBO BBC co-produced series, but we've only covered the first of 4 books written by Ford Madox Ford in the 1920s in relation to this. And so, although we're only looking at episode 4, we are actually going to cover an entire book in this section. And so I think, considering it's a self-contained book, that will go through the book as the structure rather than the episode. I'll still splice in bits of the episode where I can. But let's look at how Ford tackles this book. It is called No More Parades. Now we open with, if you recall the opening of the first book, Some Do Not, it was Teachins and McMaster in the train, 1911, going through the English countryside. And so it was these two characters, the setting, perfectly summarised the last days of peace, the last years of peace. Let's contrast this with the openings of part 1 of No More Parades. Again, it's going to be simple 2 characters. You could almost think of it as opening on a stage. The opening scene for a play. But the setting is so much different. And the types of characters that are involved as well. In the first part, we had complete upper class characters. Not so now at the start. He'll bring in Teachins, Ford will, but it's not how he's immediately going to introduce you to the scene of the base, which is going to be set in France. Here's Ford. When you came, the space was desultory, rectangular, warm after the drip of the winter night, and transfused with a brown-orange dust that was light. It was shaped like the house of a child draws. 3 groups of brown limbs, spotted with brass, took dim highlights from the shafts that came from a bucket pierced with holes, filled with an incandescent coke and covered in with a sheet of iron in the shape of a funnel. 2 men, as if hierarchically smaller, crouched on the floor beside the brazier. 4, 2 at each end of the hut, drooped over the tables in attitudes of extreme indifference. From the eaves above the parallelogram of black that was the doorway fell intermittent drippings of collected moisture, persistent, with glass-like intervals of musical sound. 2 men squatting on their heels over the brazier. They had been miners, and there the class comes in, right, lower class this time. Began talking in low sing-song of dialect, hardly audible. It went on and on, monotonously, without animation. It was as if one told the other long, long stories, to which his companion manifested his comprehension or sympathy with animal grunts. And Ford continues that enormous echoes pushed these men, to the right, to the left, or down towards the tables. And so we're not in Teachins' comfort zone anymore. That's what immediately gets sprung to mind. And also, we're not in England's comfort zone anymore. One was, they talk about others, someone being of Canadian, of English origin, just to give the imperial function of the British Army at this point, the imperial nature of it. One, a young regular officer born in Scotland but educated at Oxford. The other, nearly middle-aged and heavy, came from Yorkshire and was in a militia battalion. The English sergeant major was also almost tearfully worried about the enforced lateness of the draft. This, of course, now is Teachins, and this is his job. This is what he's going to do throughout this episode and throughout this book. Be concerned with getting the draft off on time. And he works under Campion to do so. It would be 12 midnight before they could march them off. It was no right to keep them hanging about like that. And so also there's going to enter, at this point, a nemesis or a sort of counterpart to Teachins. Teachins' genius. A more working class, more up-and-coming genius in the form of McKechnie. It's also going to be this sort of classicist, good with languages, but the war's broken him. And of course, he's not from the same background as Teachins. He doesn't share the same reactionary views. He doesn't have the same Weltanschauung that Teachins had, particularly between 1911 and 14, that we were introduced to in the first book. McKenzie has none of this. but he does have a spark of genius about him, and it's been broken by the onslaught of war. We're now meant to be, I think, deep into 1917, 1918, almost at this point. And so there's an element of base misery. I'm on page 290, if you're following the Penguin Classics, where he felt his nostrils to be inordinately dilated so that the air pouring into them was cold. And then later, when its circumstances came whole by the disintegration of the atom, the world would come to an end. In the millennium there would be no giving or taking orders. Of course he obeyed his orders till then. You have this constant onslaught. The German air raids had lately become continuous. The base was packed with men, tighter than sardines. Down in the town, you could not move in the streets. So they're in this little chateau, there's quite rural chateau, big field surrounding it. But there is obviously the nearby town. They're still, even though they're in France, and France, of course, has been, it's had its 1789 and all consequences thereafter. Completely different 19th century to England. It still has that little remembrances before the Great War of the chateau, the town. Still a bit of class touch going on there. But of course, the juxtaposition is that men packed tight as sardines in there and Tietjens getting them ready to draft. The setting already seems of a different world, whereas before the war, it was still fully functional. And you have there a bit broadening out the theme we had in the first book, which was the end of England, and now it's sort of European-wide conflagration. But of course, Tietjens, remember this is called No More Parades, but really Tietjens is still keeping up the parade. Keeping up that Protestant work ethic as well. He must be a good officer. He had the DSO with a clasp, the MC, and some foreign ribbon map. And the general said he was, with the additional odd piece of information that he was a Vice-Chancellor's Latin prizeman, that being McKenzie, that he wondered if General Campion knew what a Vice-Chancellor's Latin prizeman was. Campion wanted to show that he was a man of culture, I think, by putting them together. Oh, these are two men of culture, I'll put them together. This is the great Campion idea. Now, the show takes this as sort of Campion not really liking either of them and being sort of put the two of them together. Why not? At least their shenanigans will be kept in one place. And the theme there, of course, is the women at home. There's a woman at home troubling Mackenzie, and we already know of Tietjens' Homefront worries. And then Ford, page 292, gets into this idea that, everyone's packed as sardines, but they're all men, right? And the repression of the passionate drive them mad. He must have been being sober, disciplined, patient, absolutely repressed, ever since 1914, against the background of hellfire, row, blood, mud, old tins. He sighed a little. That was the life of all those several millions. So Ford here is giving in his own view of the war. He fought it himself, and he felt that this was an element to it, that the 11 to 14 decadence was there, but then suddenly the sobriety, the shock of war, jolted men, and they were so close. In France, you were still so close to home. But here's Ford on the war more widely. He goes into this 292. It's Tietjens, but there's clearly a lot of Ford going on here. You seem to see them winding away over a great stretch of country, the head slowly settling down, as in the zoo you will see an enormous serpent slowly sliding down into its water tank, settling down out there a long way away, up against the impassable barrier that stretched from the depths of the ground to the peak of heaven. Intense dejection, endless muddles, endless follies, endless villainies. All these men given into the hands of the most cynically carefree intriguers, in long corridors who made plots that harrowed the hearts of the world. All these men toys, all these agonies, merely occasions for picturesque phrases to be put into politicians' speeches without heart or even intelligence. Hundreds of thousands of men tossed here and there in that sordid, gigantic mud-brownness of midwinter. By God, exactly as if they were gnats wilfully picked up and thrown over the shoulder by magpies. But men, not just populations. And a little jibe there at the statistics, right? You hear of populations, you're thinking of statistics. Tietjens himself has been in the Department of Statistics. He's somewhat culpable, somewhat liable to that interpretation of man. And the base was not a meditation. There's nothing here to say, just because he's not at the front, oh, the war was easy. That's an ongoing theme of what Ford tries to bring across in No More Parades. Drafts, they haunt Tietjens. A base is a place where you meditate, or at least you should. Perhaps you should pray. A place where to be in peace, so the Tommies should write their last letters home and describe the old guns in the row, the owling audibly, says Ford, giving the apostrophes before the H's. But of course, that's not what this is. And that writing of the home front, that when you're in the base even closer to the home front, it's even almost its own agony. Because there's another theme throughout this book that Ford wants to get at. It's the distrust of the home front. Of course, we know what that meant on the German side when they lost. But there was this own sense, there was a British version of that. It wasn't quite, nothing materialised to the level of stab in the back or any of that. But there is a sense when you were the Tommy in France that there was distrust of the home front. Heavy depression, this is Ford. Heavy depression settled down heavily upon him, Tietjens. The distrust of the home cabinet, felt by the greater part of that army, became like physical pain. They could die, they could be massacred by the 250,000 in shambles, but that they should be massacred without jauntiness, without confidence, with depressed brows, without parade. Of course, the double meaning there. And Tietjens himself was under suspicion. That's the element of why Campion also puts him together with McKenzie. No man can be so brilliant but not to raise suspicion. Probably Campion imagined they had no work to do in that unit. They might become an acting lunatic ward, but if McKenzie was Campion's nephew, the thing was explained. The lunatic exclaimed, "Campion, my uncle, why he's yours?" Tietjens says, "No, he isn't." So they're trying to figure out why, who's been put together. Neither of them can believe it. Of course, we know Tietjens has his sympathies with France, somewhat diluted, but he pictures France back in the 18th century, Germany in the 20th. There's an element of that war going on inside Tietjens' head. He's trying to live it out. Ford here literally calls the base as a place where you can get an intolerable pang of home news. And that is the description when you think of that. The base is almost a purgatory. We said Tietjens has to go through the war. He has to go through hell in order to emerge at the other side with Valentine Wannop. This is not the hell. This is more purgatory. The home front is close. It's tangible. And as we'll see, Sylvia will still be able to sort of enter this world. She will not be able to enter the world in the next episode 5. Sylvia Tietjens has been excruciatingly unfaithful to Tietjens at this point. He's haunted by that. He still gets glimpses of the papers. But then lately it says that he knew nothing of where she was. And then across the phantasmagoria of the war, strode Tietjens to Valentine. But there's also a phantasmagoria of what is Sylvia up to in the mind of Tietjens at this point. And of course he has to watch the home front. There's another thing about the home front. The decadence of the home front, the distrust of it. Newspaper owning financial peers. Tietjens sees it coming in. The destruction of the Lords. The destruction of his England. It's getting filtered back through him. And Tietjens feels in this place that he hasn't got a friend in the world. Now, he's quite good at focusing in on his task. Send out the draft. And the show makes, a nice comical play of this, where the dysfunction of the Imperial units come to play, where Tietjens is so good at sending them out, he has to send them out, but something happens to a train line, something happens to this or that line of communication, and the draft has to come back. And there's nowhere for them to come back because they're getting prepared for the next draft. And you see this. Tietjens is the only one functioning in a world of dysfunction, but his own function exacerbates everyone else's dysfunction. There's a small piece that's honed in on in both the show and the book of imperial dysfunction. It's a place of like trying to get enough tin hats. Inside the shrapnel shell was an iron bar with a flattened broad nose. The shell burst in the air. This iron object fell to the ground, and since it became often from a great height, its fall was dangerous. The men called these candlesticks, which they resembled. They're getting bombarded. Teachings wants tin hats on people. If I wanted tin hats for my own headquarters, I had to write to HQ Canadians, Aldershot, or some such place in order to get the issue sanctioned. Our headquarters are full of Huns doing Huns work, McKenzie said hatefully. Oh, the world's pretty rotten, all right, Teachins answered. There's a little back and forth between them, but this idea, and there's another one about fire extinguishers. He can't get fire extinguishers. He has to write to 7 different departments in order to get the correct number of fire extinguishers in the base. And of course, that jibe back that we're full of Huns shows the difference between McKenzie and Teachins. McKenzie has had more front exposure. The Huns are on his mind a bit more. Teachins thinks of English dysfunction, thinks of the home front. Let's elaborate a bit more on McKenzie. Page 301. Captain McKenzie was an officer of His Majesty's the King, the property, body and soul of His Majesty and His Majesty's War Office. It was Teachins' duty to preserve this fellow, as it was his duty to prevent deterioration in any piece of the King's property. That was implicit in the Oath of Allegiance. But he'd been granted leave from 14th to 29th of the 11th, that puts us in an autumn, I believe, of 1917, for the purpose of obtaining a divorce. Of course, it's divorce, and it's going to haunt Teachins. McKenzie was granted divorce leave. Sort of thing Teachins should be granted. But of course, Teachins is continuing with the parade. The memory seemed to burst inside him with the noise of one of those beastly enormous tin pot crashes, and it always came when the guns made that particular kind of tin pot crash. The two came together. The internal one, the crash outside. The great bit of writing and juxtaposition there of Ford. We finally get on page 302 an allusion in Ford's writings that we've had on the show since, I think, episode 2, where Campion literally has to write the protocol for ending a lot of these battalions. Right, the band would play Land of Hope and Glory. The adjutant would say there will be no more parades. You get that in writing now, page 302, the start of this book. We get some more clarification of the languages that Mackenzie speaks. He talks about, I think, 7 languages, and of course not Latin and Greek, assumed still to have known them. But the first chapter of this first part of the second book ends with this traumatic event, the death of one 09 Morgan. And this is going to haunt Teachins throughout the book. Talk about a man of duty. Right? It was his duty to defend these men. This happens around page 304. He comes in. It's actually done in a nice harrowing way in the episode, about 20 minutes in. He sort of ends in with some message about getting the draft off or not, but he's been shelled and there's this piece of shrapnel in him and stuff. 09 Morgan comes into Teachins' hut, or place he's made as his little HQ out on the field, not in the chateau with Campion noticeably, but out in the field outside amongst the men. The eye looked jauntily at the peak canvas hut roof, gone with a grin. This is 09 Morgan staring up dead at him. A Teachins hanging over him. Singular, the fellow should have spoken. After he was dead. He must have been dead when he spoke. It was sentimental to say, Du bist Mann eine Blume. Damn the German language. But that fellow was a Jew. One should not say that one's woman was like a flower, any flower. We have here him talking, I think, this is the beginning of his modernist, the modernist nature of it. He goes back, talks about, I think, Mackenzie at that point, because they were talking about their own poetry skills. Is death better than discovering that your wife is a whore and being done by her cully? We see here the Mackenzie, the 09 Morgan's tales wrap themselves in Teachins' head. Guelango na guilt. I think there's some even death is better than dishonor. The own regiment band bore the words of the Welsh regiment where 09 Morgan was from. No, not death. Anga means pain, anguish. Anguish is better than dishonor. Teachins there quickly trying to do the translations of the language. And of course he has to deal with his friends and so on. And he enters the mess later with his own bloody shoes in a fright. And that's the end of chapter 1. That's you are immersed into Teachins' new world. The England of the Sussex countryside, the Kent countryside, where there was the lark and the nightingale discussion, who was singing in the morning between himself and Valentine One-Up. Long gone here. is death better than dishonor? Well, he's seen both, and both are pretty harrowing to him at the moment. So chapter 2 opens with more of this imperial dysfunction. Where's the draft? Getting the draft ready. Tietjens recollects, I think at this point, 309 I'm at now. His feminine solicitude enraged and overwhelmed Tietjens with blackness. Strange call-out to his feminine solicitude there. He told the Sergeant Major that he was going to go to hell, and of course that is what awaits in episode 5, for he himself was not going to leave that hut until the draft was moved off. Captain McKenzie could do as he pleased. This feminine solicitude, I suppose it's Tietjens' idea that because he's still getting distracted by these Welsh translations, despite the hauntingness of Unan Morgan, his duty to get the draft out, his idea of the duty of Morgan and Mackenzie and these people such like as being the king's property. So we've got more of a back and forth. Mackenzie said he would translate this sonnet. That's another ongoing theme. Mackenzie's mind now. Mackenzie almost at this point replaces McMaster. Instead, he's not a protege that Tietjens wants, but he's almost an adversary. And he's coming up from the lower classes. He's a bit unruly, he's unwiry. There's no discipline to Mackenzie, but there is a genius. And to a certain extent, Mackenzie embodies there the sort of man that will dominate the first half of the 20th century. Unruly genius, but unstable as well. So this competition of who, Tietjens gives him some sort of sonnet. He can translate it into Latin hexameters in under 3 minutes. Gives him the envelope. There's a sealed place, a sealed envelope, and this whole thing about did Mackenzie open it. And Tietjens' story goes on from there. Mackenzie obsesses about this sealed envelope, that he will do it in under 3 minutes. So despite Mackenzie's unruly genius, there's a sense where he needs to show his worthiness to Tietjens, to the old guard. Tietjens represents the old class system at its best, at its noblesse oblige. And Mackenzie, some deep fundamental level, you would say, recognizes that. And even though he does the translation, he has to show that the envelope's not sealed. He has to show that he has abided by the rules when in front of Tietjens. And there's this good piece, 314. He sat scribbling fast. Old Spectre blows a cold protecting breath. Vanity of vanities, the preacher saith. No more parades, not any more, no oil. He was telling Hotchkiss, this is Tietjens, was telling Hotchkiss, who was obviously shy of approaching the Glamorganshires in their anteroom. Unambergrist our limbs in naked soil, that he did not suppose that any PB off. The modernist writing at this point mimics the feverish poetry and the absurdity of the situation. So the sonnet and the writing of the sonnet feverishly by Tietjens, Ford then sort of mimics this in his modernist writing. No funeral instruments cast before our rates, this sort of poetic language. He's half scribbling the poem down. He's half conveying what's around him. And so it's an interesting mimicry going on there. And of course, the poetry themselves can come over someone in such a fever, in such a frantic moment. And timing the poems like the way someone can time the shells. You're writing a poem in a frenzy, but then sometimes it still has to have its meter, its structure. And so the shells are carnage, but people have timed them. They know the weight in them by the sound of them at this point into the war. And so you have this juxtaposition of the shells falling around them with the feverish writing of the poetry, which I thought was a clever technique by Ford. Of course, Tietjens, when he goes back to the NCO, he's amongst the NCOs, we get a different flavour of the bass. Page 317. The tobacco smoke from the pipes of the NCOs at the other end of the room hung, opalescent, beneath the wire cages. The brilliant hurricane lamps hung over each table. Buttons and minerals gleamed in the air. The universal khaki tinge of the limbs seemed to turn brown as if into a gas dust. Money, women, testamentary brothers, each of these complications from over the Atlantic and round the world were of his own troubles. A world in labour, an army being moved off in the night, shoved off, anyhow, and over the top. And we're introduced to another character at this base, one Colonel Levin. Here's the introduction of Colonel Levin. His eyes met the non-committal glance of a dark, gentlemanly, thin fellow with a strikingly scarlet hat band, a lot of gilt about his khaki, and little strips of steel chain armour on his shoulders. Levin, Colonel Levin. GSO 2 or something attached to the General Lord Edward Campion. How the hell did these fellows get into these intimacies of commanders of units and their men, swimming in like fishes into the brown air of a tank and there at your elbows? Spies. Now, Levin turns out to be an all-right character, but it's just another great descriptively indulgent paragraph there by Ford. Levin, though, he's kind of teaching his friend. Ultimately, he's Campion's man. And here we go. I think Teachins uses an outburst, yells at him about the tin hats piece. I've had, Teachins said, a man killed on my hands, that being Onan Morgan, this afternoon because we have to draw tin hats from my orderly room from Dublin on an AFB Canadian from Aldershot, killed here. We've only just mopped up the blood from where you're standing. And so Levin is the outlet in which Teachins can air his grief. Amongst all of this, Teachins gets more disillusioned. Are the army just a tool of politicians and civilians? And remember, he doesn't like this. Teachins is reactionary. This idea of a people's army, no, he wants a standing army. And he always said the end of the standing army, the incoming of the full draft, the mandated draft, was the end of England. That was it. The expeditionary force was the one. And it's now the tool of politicians and civilians. Equally distrustful on the home front in the eyes of Teachins. It's not just being led by donkeys. It's not that vision that Teachins simply has. He has distrust of the British English civilians being entailed into this war. Total war for him is an aberration. And of course, the only thing giving him solace now is the thought of Groby. Groby could be absently satisfied, was in some orderly room or other, as long as his thoughts went to Groby, the only place in the world. Why? It was a queer thing. Not queer, really. It was a matter of inevitable selection if you came to think of it. And here we have the two, the romantic Teachins and suddenly the sister Teachins who's in the Department of Statistics coming back. No. It's perfectly logical if you think about it. An acting orderly room, Lance Corporal was selected for penmanship, his power of elementary figuring, his trustworthiness amongst the innumerable figures and messages, and his dependability. But Groby comes through that like as Ford calls it, a slumbering Arcadia. And there's a glimpse there of war. I mean, there is inevitable bits of Brideshead Revisited to this, or that you can see in Brideshead Revisited. The slumbering Arcadia of Groby, the beginning of chapters of Et in Arcadia Ego of Wall's Brideshead Revisited. The fact it was a base, we have our main character in Brideshead Revisited be in the army when he returns to Brideshead. It's almost like, War wanted to do a similar experience that Ford had done, but bring it forward a bit. So, of course, it's World War II and he's nostalgic for his youth in the 20s. It's slightly different, but you can definitely see the influence. But he's not in Arcadia. He's in this melting pot of madness. And, the next few pages of chapter 2, just go through that. An unraveling is the sense you get from the chaos, the draft coming back and all of that. Teachins losing his trust in Campion. And we finally, on page 329, get his first thoughts of Wannop giving him calm throughout this, right? So we have a few pages of build-up, this madness at the base, and then bottom of page 329. If it was not a married woman, it might be Miss Wannop. If it was, it couldn't be. An immense waft of calm, sentimental happiness had descended upon him. Of course, he's seeing mistresses at the front or something that's talked about. And Teachins doesn't like this at all. And of course, the irony is it's of course going to be Sylvia coming to him. Those watching the show get a bit more of a chance to see this. And then I believe page 334, before we round off chapter 2, we get the actual reference to the Inferno. Just in case you weren't sure if Ford had this in mind. What was the fellow in the Inferno who was buried in the neck in ice and begged Dante to clear the icicles out of his eyelids so that he could see out of them? Dante kicked him in the face because he was a Ghibelline. Always a bit of a swine, that Dante. But that's the sort of thoughts that Tietjens has as we close out chapter 2. There are 4 chapters to part 1. There's actually 3 parts to this book. There was only 2 parts to the previous book. So chapter 3 is Tietjens ruminating on his relationship, and then we see Sylvia arrive from Tietjens' perspective, and then we close out with the arrival. We have this Hotchkiss affair in chapter 4, where Tietjens digs himself into more trouble about how others perceive him at the base. All of this is lining up to, of course, the night he has with Sylvia. But right now, beginning of chapter 3, part 1, book 2, all sorts of singular things seem to have been going on around him in the vague zone outside all this engrossed and dust-coloured world, in the vague zone that held, civilian population, tea parties, short of butter. English people of good position consider that the basis of all marital unions or disunions is the maxim, no scenes. And this is completely what is not going to happen now. The final chance of Christopher and Sylvia to be together is going to be ruined by the greatest of all scenes, which will send Tietjens to the front. And of course, Ford being Ford, we don't see that scene. We get the build-up, we get the recollection, and outcomes. The scene, of course, is inserted itself. Stoppard has to do this in episode 4 and put the scene in where Tietjens punches an orderly and faces Campion has no choice but send him to the front thereafter. English people of good position consider the basis of all marital unions, page 336. Or disunions is the maxim, no scenes. Obviously for the sake of the servants, or the same thing as the public. No scenes then for the sake of the public. The instinct for privacy means you can't do anything from the public, but that also means your servants. He restrains from drinking so he can think cold-bloodedly of Sylvia. Grey stillness, grey horrors, in front, behind, amongst the civilian populations. That's the mind of Tietjens right now. You are, in fact, a changed man with a mind of a different specific gravity. You could not even tell that the roseate touches of dawn in the mist were not really the effects of rum. He imagined Sylvia in her convent and done with. Miss Wannop he had not been able to imagine at all, but she had deemed to be done with. You cannot force your mind to a deliberate, consecutive recollection, unless you are in the mood. Then it will do whether you want to or not. Growing conviction that his wife was forcing herself into an attitude of caring for him begins to haunt him now. These pages, about 340. We get a reiteration that he believes that the child Michael is his. Again, we've discussed that Michael relationship and how you believe what you want to believe, and you turn that into reality with whether or not his son is genuinely his or whether he's Gerald Drake's. He recollects that Sylvia wanted to force him into Wannop's arms. We had that at the close of episode 3. That was the one chance to save the marriage in Sylvia's eyes. Tietjens does the dirty, comes back to Sylvia. They're both equal now. But of course he had not done it. He did not get with Wannop before he went off to the front. So now he's left in this position. These actions or inactions still haunting him. But in Tietjens' mind, he does possess sin. Like any man. He was not immune from the 7 deadly sins in the way of a man. One might lie, yet not bear false witness against a neighbour. One might kill, yet not without fitting provocation or of self-interest. One might conceive of theft as raving cattle from the false Scots, which was the Yorkshireman's duty. Sylvia doesn't get this. Sylvia thinks Tietjens sees himself without sin, but of course that's not the case. And then when he hears she's here, there's this great, a line by Ford 345, where he says that Sylvia is not capable of vulgarity except with a purpose. She had come without any sort of passports or papers, just walking past gentlemen in their wooden boxes at pier heads and the like, in conversation with, of all people in the world, with Perrone. And of course that's how Sylvia gets through the front. She sees Perrone in King's Cross. We're literally given this scene in the episode by Stoppard, and she swoons her way into France and right into the base. It's an extraordinary show of lack of care. And of course, Perone pays for this. But he has always been a bumbling idiot, the worst, the most fawning for Sylvia. Perone himself had been returning from leave with the king's dispatches or something glorified of the staff sort. They give Perone some glorified position without much actual force, and he still manages to muck it up. And of course, we get this paranoia of Campion as well, of Tietjens, that as a man of intellect, Campion was convinced Tietjens was dissatisfied with his lowly job of draft forwarding officer and wanted a place in the extravagantly cushy kind in his general's own entourage. But he's unsound. That's what he is, unsound. He's too brilliant, in the words of Campion there, page 347. So the final chapter of part 1 talks about... This emerges the Hotchkiss affair. This man had been put in charge of horses, but he's actually an old bumbling idiot. And of course, Tietjens and horses is going to take great care and great consideration for them, and he will not like to see them be mismanaged. We get images of him still being haunted by Onan Morgan's death at the beginning of chapter 4. We get the draft coming back. The Hotchkiss affair really comes in on page 366. The Earl of Beacon, a Levantine officer and racehorse owner, was interested himself in army horses after a short visit to the lines of communication. The adjutant would no doubt have observed a veterinary Lieutenant Hotchkiss or Hitchcock. "So," Cowley said, "you'll be under him as far as your horse lines go, if you go up." Perhaps Lord Beacon was a friend of Captain Tietjens and had asked for him to. I think this is a bit of Mark Tietjens manoeuvring, trying to get him a softer job, but of course Tietjens rumples up against the wrong characters. Captain Tietjens was known to be wonderful with horses. And so there's the beginning of the Hotchkiss affair. Lieutenant Hotchkiss, who, being a professor, had never actually seen a horse. This is 368, the absurdity Ford puts in there. Or not even for 10 years. Old bumbling idiot, basically. He remembered, this Tietjens, that Valentine Wannop, with exaggerated ideas as to the safety of the first-line transport, had begged Tietjens to get him a mark as divisional officer. So he remembers now that he's kind of here for the reasons of Valentine, trying to look out for him. But he could not let a horse for which he was responsible be martyred, and he sees his position. An odd skylark was declaiming over an empty field behind the incinerators at headquarters. Everybody yells at Hotchkiss, gets in trouble for it. Another person he's rumpled up the wrong way. Then just at the close of part 1, you get odd skylark was declaiming over an empty field behind the incinerators headquarters. An odd lark. That brings us back to his episode with Valentine. For as a rule, larks do not sing in December. Larks sing only when courting, or over the nest. The bird must be oversexed. Now, before we leave part 1, part 2 will give us more into Sylvia Tietjens' mind. There's 2 chapters to part 2 and 2 chapters to part 3. There's 2 more paragraphs that Ford gives us in this part, which I want to look at. One is Tietjens' view of God. That comes on 360. And the other is a key paragraph on discipline and imperial dysfunction, which comes on 362. They actually come quite close together in this final chapter of part 1 of book 2, No More Parades. Here is Tietjens' view of God. 2 paragraphs. Tietjens had walked in the sunlight down the lines, past the hut, where the evergreen climbing rose in the sunlight, thinking in an interval good-humouredly about his official religion, about the Almighty, as on a colossal scale a great English landowner, benevolently awful, a colossal duke who never left his study and was thus invisible, but knowing all about the estate down the last hind at the home farm and the last oak. Of course, Tietjens would picture God as a landowner, English landowner. Christ, an almost too benevolent land steward, son of the owner, knowing all about the estate, down to the last child of the porter's lodge, apt to be got round by the more detrimental tenants. The third person of the Trinity, the spirit of the estate, the game, as it were, as distinct from the players of the game, the atmosphere of the estate, that of the interior of Winchester Cathedral, just after the Handel anthem had been finished. perpetual Sunday, with probably a little cricket for the young men. Like Yorkshire of a Saturday afternoon, if you looked down on the whole broad county, you would not see a single village of green without its white flannels. That was why Yorkshire always leads the averages. Probably by the time you got to heaven, you would be so worn out by work on this planet that if you would accept the English Sunday forever, you would do so with extreme relief. With his belief that all that was good in English literature ended with the 17th century, his imaginations of heaven must be materialist like Bunyan's. He laughed good-humouredly at his projection of a hereafter. It was probably done with, along with cricket. There would be no more parades of that sort. Probably they would play some beastly yelping game, like baseball or association football. And heaven? It would be a revival meeting on a Welsh hillside, or a Chautauqua, whatever that was. And God? A real estate agent with Marxist views. Brilliant insight into where Tietjens' head was there. The death of the English country estate, and the death of Tietjens' idea that that is what God could have been. His perfect explanation of the Trinity, something nested in Tietjens' own view of Yorkshire. Then replaced the real estate agent, either the arch-capitalist, with a Marxist view, right? And now let's look at the imperialist function paragraph. Great war, mechanized warfare, as the undoing of the disciplined army, the undoing of the civilian, the end of England, the end of the empire. The whole organisation of his confounded battalion fell to pieces. It appeared that a circular had come round 3 months before Tietjens had even been given command of that unit, asking for the experienced first-class officers, warrant officers, capable of serving as instructors in officers' training corps, with commissions. Sergeant Major Cowley had been recommended by the colonel of the depot. Sergeant Major Ledoux, by his own colonel. Tietjens felt as if he had been let down, but of course he had not been. It was just the way of the army all the time. You get a platoon, or a battalion, or, for the matter of that, a dugout or tent by Herculean labours into good fettle. It ran all night for a day or two, and then it fell to pieces. The personnel scattered to the four winds by what appeared merely wanton orders, coming from the most unexpected headquarters. The premises were smashed up by a chance shell that might just as well have been fallen somewhere else. This is the finger of fate. And so there we have it, Tietjens and his landscape. We go on to part 2. Now, part 2, chapter 1, Sylvia and Perron. The affair revisited, really. We saw most of this wedged into episode 1, so I don't want to rehash everything. Here's the beginning of part 2. In the admirably appointed, white-enamelled, wicker-worked, bemirrored lounge of the best hotel of that town, Sylvia Tietjens sat in a wicker work chair, not listening, rather abstractly, to a staff major, who was lachrymosely and continuously begging her to leave a bedroom door unlocked that night. So, there, very good openings by Ford. Again, that's reminiscent of the train carriage opening of part 1. Some do not. And basically, Sylvia's zeal at this point is, by the immortal saints, I'll make his wooden face wince yet. That's her thing. Damn his chivalry, let's haunt him, just as she's also haunting Perron at this moment. Though she will always think of him as a little man, right? She's drawn Tietjens' bank account to the brink to try and make him budge, trying to humiliate him to a certain extent by going off to Perron. I mean, she admits that as much to Perron, thus trying to humiliate Perron as well. And that's really because, about page 382, we get Perron's 380 actually. We get this finally an insight into Perron's character as written out by Ford. Major Wilfred Fosbrook Edgar Perron of Perron, the son of his mother, was one of those individuals who have no history, no strong proclivities, nothing. His knowledge seemed to be bounded by the contents of his newspaper for the immediate day. At any rate, his conversation never went any farther. He was not bold, he was not shy. He was neither markedly courageous nor markedly cowardly. His mother allowed him, after an eye-opener in early youth, the income of a junior royalty, but he did nothing with it. He lived in a great house in Palace Gardens, Kensington, and he lived all alone with rather a large staff of certain servants who had been selected by his mother. But they did nothing at all. For he ate all his meals, and even took his bath and dressed for dinner at the bath club. He was otherwise parsimonious. And of course, Sylvia 383 gives the lines we saw in the first episode, that it's the difference, between Christopher and Perron is the difference between listening to a grown man and with an intense boredom trying to entertain an inarticulate schoolboy. As beside him, other men simply did not seem to ever have been grown up. And of course, by trying to humiliate Teachings by going off with Perron, she'd only further humiliated herself in the process by admitting through action that Perron was worth going off with. When Sylvia on men in general, here at the bottom of 387, men at any rate never fulfilled expectations. They might upon acquaintance turned out more entertaining than they appeared, but almost always taking up with a man was like reading a book you had read when you had forgotten that you had read it. And that's a key take on Sylvia's experience. Teachings' stubbornness, Teachings' duty, Teachings' care had become too repetitive for Sylvia. But, Perron falls into the same traps in her eyes. Repetitive nature to their characters. And, of course, Sylvia's in town in this setting, which isn't done in the show. In the show, she goes straight to the chateau. They leave this sort of nearby town. But in Ford's work, the nearby town, some small French town, not too far off from the front, is where a bit more of the debauchery happens. It's where, a man can find his woman if he needs it. Teachings, of course, never leaves his camp to go to this town. Whereas Sylvia's straight there at the best hotel. as Perron. Sylvia, at page 390, she says, "You went to war when you decided to rape innumerable women." That's her view of what the war is. It was what war was for. All these men crowded into this narrow space. And so, part 2, chapter 1, we're inside Sylvia's head as she arrives into the nearby town. Part 2, chapter 2, it's Sylvia at the base. And all of the damage that she's going to wreak upon. She appears up to Teachings. And it's that, Drake, comes in, possibly the father Michael, but she goes, well, what was that all for? It becomes this thing in her past. What was I even doing then? Because she's committed to try and win Teachings back. She's committed to have the one last attempt. Of course, she gets past Campion, because Campion is a soft spot for Sylvia. Always has. The general loved her desperately, page 400. Her, Sylvia, in quite a proper manner for an elderly general. Interesting point, page 400, this idea of France is the 18th century for Teachings. The undissolvable air of the 18th century that the French contrived to retain in all their effects kept the scene singularly together when Sylvia arrives at this base. And when she even hears Teachings speaking French, it's in this old reactionary voice. It was like hearing Chateaubriand talk, as if Chateaubriand had been brought up in an English hunting country. Of course, Christopher would cultivate an English accent on purpose to show that he was an English country gentleman speaking French. That's the type of particular man he is. This is a France that's been haunted by the Dreyfus Affair, right? So this is not just your 18th century France. Germany's had the population boom. There's a sense that France is the dying country. And when she sees Teachings, there's odd bits. She's happy he's free of the odious creature McMaster, right? Sylvia never really liked him. Of course, she doesn't even get to see who's replaced him, the lunatic McKenzie. And the whole thing about Christopher's sympathies with the French, was Dreyfus, was he a socialist, was he this, was he that? Christopher's falling in the same mark, according to Ford, this idea that he's become a socialist. And Sylvia finds it so absurd, She, of course, can't help but indulge it at the dinner table. Of course, this is the wrong thing to do. I mean, to be a socialist at this time in the war, we've had a great French mutiny in 1917. It is too treacherous to even play with. But Sylvia is still in those lines. She's only been on the home front this whole time. She has not had the Tietjens experience that we just saw in the first part. And so she ramps up. I mean, Tietjens already has Onan Morgan on his head, haunting him, right? It is on his head. He has the Hotchkiss affair, where he's rubbed up the man in charge of horses the wrong way. He's going to have the punch with the major and the upsetting of Perron. I think when Sylvia sees him, though, there's a sense that she realizes he's been mooning over the one-up girl, is what's called. He would be mooning forever over the one-up girl, page 407. Or her memory. That was all one. That's why she wanted him to get with her that night, so that he wouldn't have that hauntingness of one-up. Okay, yeah, he has the haunt of the war and on Morgan, but he also has that hauntingness of he did not get with Valentine on the night he could have. Sylvia recognizes this. He was content with love. Love alone. If he knew that the one-up girl was loving him in Bedford Park, and he in the Khyber States, with the Himalayas between them, he would be quite content. That would be correct in its way, but not very helpful for other women. And we get on 408, Sylvia reiterating what Tietjens had said of her in part 1, that if she's vulgar for a purpose. If I am vulgar, I'm vulgar with a purpose. Then it's not vulgarity. It may be vice, it may be viciousness, but it's not vulgarity. And that's Tietjens he knows Sylvia well by this point. And so still, at this time, 410, it's kind of Sylvia's last play. She plays the Michael card, the last stud-wide hope of the Groby breed, is the sort of language that Tietjens gives it. But of course, Tietjens is becoming self-ostracized from Groby. Yes, it's his Arcadia, but let's remember, Arcadia is a magical place. It's not a place you ever can truly inhabit again. And I think that self-ostracism from Groby has only exacerbated the Arcadia in his mind. And to a certain degree, he knows he'll never be back to Groby, or at least a pre-war Groby. And Groby, Mark's still around. Mark reading his correspondence with his copy of the Times airing on a chair back before the fire. It was just the man to retain the 1840 idea that you can catch cold by reading a damp newspaper. Mark, this disinterested man, will see the last of Groby. He had said that he could have Groby, but she would understand that she could have Groby, that being Sylvia, but he could understand that his father being now dead, and he and a public official, without children and occupied in London with work that suited him, Groby was practically Christopher's property to do with it as he liked. So Groby haunts Tietjens. To a certain degree, thinks he can never be back there. But Sylvia the materialist sees this chance now as a chance to get Groby. His father had certainly died of a broken heart at the rumours that were going on about his son, and we saw this in the previous episode. Rumours she, Sylvia, almost as efficiently as the man called Ruggles and more irresponsible gossips, had set going about Christopher. They had been meant to smash him. They'd smashed his father instead. She gives him news of McMaster. She calls him lower, Mr. and Lady McMaster. Sylvia sees them as lower class sponges for what they are, trying to the McMaster Fridays in an attempt to career up the upper echelons. But they're upstarts for Sylvia. And it's hard to know what Tietjens makes of this. I think Tietjens has made his peace with the McMaster. Tietjens, as we've said, likes the McMaster character. He's been somewhat corrupted. There is always going to be an element of corruption. Look at Tietjens himself. His life is not perfect. The protege does not always work out as you want, but there's an admiration that he had instilled in McMaster the prospects of the career. The knighthood, though it's in McMaster's name, is still in Tietjens' actions. Sylvia will never understand the sort of nuance that is between them. Now we've had the crashings of the guns and the air raids all sounded to Tietjens at the camp. What about Sylvia in the town? 429, we get a slight insight into this. The crashings of the gun and of all the instruments for making noise seemed to her so atrocious and odious because they were for her the silly pomp of a schoolboy man's game. Campion or some similar schoolboy said, "Hello, some German airplanes about." That lets us out on the air gun. So again, this idea that it's the schoolboys. Sylvia sees the world populated by Perrones more than Tejances. And to a certain extent, Tejances will probably agree with that. But there is still that carnage, and Sylvia's still human. She recognizes it. These horrors, these infinities of pain, this atrocious condition of the world had been brought into in order that men should indulge themselves in orgies of promiscuity. But again, that's the idea of the war, all wars for rape, Sylvia's sort of maxim. That in the end was at the bottom of male honour, of male virtue, observance of treaties, upholding of the flag, an immense warlock's carnival of appetites, lusts, ebrieties, and once set in motion, there was no stopping it. That's the carnage of war in Sylvia's view. We get it there. And she's also distraught about losing her identity in the war. The war becomes the collective. Everyone pools together. Sylvia was always, front image, newspaper gossip columns. She loses that a bit. She had to scream against the noise, but she had lost her identity. She was one of the crowd, which is, of course, what Sylvia Teachins never wanted to be. So, we get a bit more insight there into Sylvia. In the show, we see her lure Teachins, back into the marriage. This is what the attempt is. They have a room in the chateau, and there is the sense of the Venusberg to her, luring him back. Let's think of Wagner's Tannhäuser, where you have Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the pure Christian figure, the true love of Tannhäuser, whereas the Venusberg is the appetites of delight for Tannhäuser, and he gets lost in that world. And there's an element here where it's that final act in Tannhäuser where he goes back to he's going to go back to the Venusberg until he hears Elizabeth singing to him from heaven about his salvation. But that dualism does exist here, and on page 434, as Ford closes out part 2, he explicitly states that Sylvia hums the Venusberg music as she's almost successful in luring Tejan's back into the marriage. She felt her beauty flowing over all her limbs. She had a gown of gold tissue. Her matchless hair was coiled over her ears. She was humming Venusberg music. She knew music as if nothing else. And then, the passage literally closes off. Her gown of gold tissue was like the colobium Sidonis the king wore at the coronation. As they mounted the stairs, she thought, what a fat tenor Tannhäuser always was. The Venusberg music was dinning in her ears. She said, 66 inexpressibles. I'm as sober as a judge I need to be. That's the feeling that we get when we're lured into the idea that this can happen. And the way Stoppard plays it in episode 4 is there's always an element of Sylvia that's a little bit more sympathetic in the show. Not that Ford doesn't give her moments, but Ford gives her the moments, though, that show she's beyond that. But we are lured into thinking they might get back together. The war might bring them closer together. Is this the redemptive arc? Is the war the redemptive arc of the marriage? The show toys with that idea more than what Ford ever does at this moment. And to a certain extent, that is Sylvia's Venusberg tendencies working on the audience. Teachins has to end with one-up. To go back to Sylvia is to go back to the Venusberg. It's to be trapped in the pseudo-reality, which was the marriage. Part 3. Now, part 3 has 2 chapters. General O'Hara affair, which is what happened to that Teachins has punched this general. It happens explicitly in episode 4. We get to see it. Play out. This mistaken thing of Perron tries to interrupt Teachins with Sylvia, but then O'Hara's just in the hall, and it is a bit more. Well, he's not doing much. In the book, it's insinuated that O'Hara himself, as well as Perron, were trying to have their bit with the Venusberg. Before that, we do get the fire extinguisher play out, the imperial dysfunction. I mean, we've had a lot. Why are there no fire extinguishers? It applied to several firms from manufacturers. They'd all replied they were forbidden to sell these articles to anyone but the War Office direct. I am applying to civilian firms. This is Tietjens back to Campion, I believe, at this point. This is before the real word of what happened the night before filters true, that he basically punched a general. That comes true, page 440. And of course, it's McKechnie who comes in and says, went on breathlessly, "They say we knocked the general." And, McKechnie, lunatic, kind of raving man. "Look here, Tietjens, are you in command of this unit or am I?" Levin exclaimed sharply. What's it, Tietjens? No, Captain McKechnie explains that a senior officer should have command of this unit. McKechnie wants command back in the unit. He loves this bit of gossip. He sees Tietjens put the general, this is my chance to get back in. And the O'Hara affair has happened. Tietjens is already in trouble. All of the things that have been brewing before come back into the fold. The draft chaos, the fire extinguishers, tin hats, the haunting of 09 Morgan, the lure of the Venusberg, Perron, I mean, like a ghost flying back into Tietjens' world. A bumbling fool of a ghost, but there nonetheless. And as I said, the implications are stark. Remember, Sylvia was toying with this idea that he was a socialist, he was a spy. All this whispers around. Same thing she had managed to do in the Homefront, which, as she admitted herself earlier, had led to the father's death and the father's capitulation rather than Tietjens himself. She's now doing at the base again. Her presence is always the one to spread the gossip and the dysfunction of Tietjens. Just this morning, I was in the cabinet doing private secretary. In his cabinet doing private secretary, and he was talking while he shaved. He almost said Perron there, you see. This is Campion, or this is Levin, apologies, saying that the O'Hara affair is happening. It's filtering throughout. And he said exactly that you can take your choice of going up the line tonight or a court-martial. So now the implications are stark and in front of Tietjens. There's this idea that General O'Hara may or may not have been drunk, may or may not have been looking to get with Sylvia himself. Tietjens, of course, probably believes he was. Both. But he falls back on the idea that he himself, Tietjens, was drunk. This is the official line. Because he can't, it's discipline, right? Yeah, O'Hara is the above. Tietjens, it's the same logic Tietjens applied to when he said, when he got ruined in episode 3 and he said, Michael can be raised a Catholic. A man who loses his own prestige doesn't deserve to bring up the child. It's up to the mother to bring up the child. And similarly here, he uses a similar sort of logic where he says, if he punched the general, which he did, then he himself, Tietjens, must have been drunk. Okay, even though in reality, O'Hara was likely drunk. But he uses the logic. And he's heading to the front. I mean, this beastly war haunts Tietjens. Beastliness of human nature is always pretty normal. And so I think what Ford wanted to do with the O'Hara affair was just show that even at the base there's this beastliness to it. And there's an element that Sylvia gets right? The men always have lust on their minds, especially in a war. The animal urges, the beastly urges come out. We lie and betray and are wanting in imagination to deceive ourselves always at about the same rate, in peace and in war. But somewhere in that view there are enormous bodies of men. Tietjens just realizing every one of them is desperately afraid, but they go on. An immense blind will forces them on the effort to consummate the one decent action that humanity has to its discredit in the whole recorded of history, for the one we are engaged in. That effort is the one certain creditable fact in all their lives, but the other lives of all the men are dirty, potty, discreditable little affairs, like yours, like mine. And he's talking to Levin there. Levin cries out, what a pessimist. And then Tietjens goes, well, can't you see that's optimism? Success or failure, Tietjens said, had nothing to do with the credit of the story. And this is him accepting his fate. The front line is for him. Whether success or failure, the parade goes on. He is the Anglican saint, and this is his martyrdom to a certain extent. We see that on 447. He rejects the idea that success is necessary for moral virtue. And Levin, by not understanding this in the dialogue, Tietjens says, now Levin has Jewish roots. He's an Englishman, but he's of Jewish extraction. So Tietjens says that he betrays his non-Anglo-Saxon origins by being so vocal to Tietjens' Anglican sainthood sacrifice, not understanding it. And of course, to make up by that, we get a lot of spiel about Levin, that he is English, he has credentials, he went to Winchester School and then on to Magdalen. But of course, this is credentialism. Tietjens is tapping into something deeper. Same way when he thinks of Groby and he would take tree over house. Tietjens goes for the more fundamental aspect of human nature. Not the beastliness, but the sense of divinity in man, hence the Anglican sainthood. Now, Levin is not painted as a detestable character. I mean, we've had the Dreyfus Affair mentioned. Ford is not going on some anti-Semitic spiel here, but he's talking about subtleties, especially heightened and drawn out in times of war, that Tietjens would have recognised in men. And so that, it's quite well used by Ford. Today, you would probably see Levin, you wouldn't be able to do this with Levin, the Jewish character, have your main character Tietjens call him out in such a way, but he's not a pariah. Levin's trying to stick up for Tietjens, but there's some sort of fundamental misunderstanding between what the two men are doing or have behaved or will react in these moments. The parade goes on. The officer striking the major would be too, quote, inconspicuous an affair for Tietjens. And he was also not in uniform, or Perron was not in uniform either, because he was trying to get in with Sylvia in the nighttime. And Tietjens knows. He came with his wife's permission. And then that's it. When he realises there and then talking to Levin that Sylvia had spun it together just out of curiosity, boredom, bit of everything, he realises he has escaped the Venusberg. But this is not just the Wagnerian escape from Venusberg redemption. There's the element of the Dantaic journey going on here. He still has to go through hell and the front. And that's what we'll see in the next one. And he bids goodbye to Levin, page 55, saying, being a Turk or a Jew, you are a simple Oriental, monogamous, faithful soul. I hope to goodness the sergeant cook has the sense not to keep the men's dinners back for the general inspection. But of course he will not. Tietjens still thinking about the detail, and off he goes. Probably annoyed that he had gone so close to being, quote, roaring satyr, and so on. So we have a chapter. Of course, that says goodbye to Levin at the base, Tietjens. He knows what awaits him, but it needs to be rubber stamped. And that means he's got to have Tietjens has to have a showdown with Campion. Campion's lurked throughout the second book. And page 456, we have part 3, chapter 2, final chapter of the book, book 2, No More Parades. We get into Campion's head. I always said Campion would have this redemptive factor. We've seen in the Homefront, he's a kind of a Tory who won't go the full way, the reactionary way of Christopher. The appearance, there and then, in the present of the institutions matter to him. That's his own sort of parade, of course. But if the institutions and what is seen as acceptable within those halls changes, Campion will change along. I mean, he's conservative. He's not for the women getting the vote. He's not for numerous things the 20th century is going to bring on. But he'll go along with it. He falls for Sylvia. He falls for her lies, believes her over Christopher many a time, doesn't see through Christopher's parade, and believes, Sylvia's the darling, you've got to get back with Sylvia. And that was always one thing McMaster saw that Campion never saw. But at the beginning of this chapter, we see him, he's in charge of this base. He is a general. General Lord Edward Campion, GCB, KCMG, military, DSO, etc., sat, radiating glory and composing a confidential memorandum of the Secretary of State of War on a bully beef case, leaning forward over a military blanket that covered a deal table. We're going to get the Campion chapter intro as he awaits Tietjens and he waits to send him to the front. And there's a very interesting conception here. It's obviously Ford giving us the mind of certain generals or certain upper echelons in the war, and what he thought their minds were full of. Campion background then. He had served with great distinction in the East, as many of these men would have done in the British Empire at the time, in command mostly of mounted infantry. He had subsequently so distinguished himself in the organising and transporting of troops coming and going overseas that, of course, he gets this idea, right? He's in charge of getting the draft ready. It might at any moment be decided to move bulk of HM forces somewhere in the East. Campion, this is where it comes in, and none of this is in the show. Campion's lure eastwards. Well, there's a hint that he's going to India at the end of the show, but you don't get this depth. The idea underlying was the General Campion sought had at least some relation in the necessities of the British Empire and strategy embracing world politics as well as military movements, a fact which is often forgotten. While the obsession is on the home front, there's a negation on the East and what it means to be an empire. And in particular, Britain as conceived in Asia as an Asiatic empire. And Campion, we get a little intro into Campion's thoughts on this. The present operations on the Western Front, arduous and even creditable, as they might have been until relatively lately, were very remote from our far eastern possessions and mitigated from, rather than added to, our prestige. The unfortunate display in front of Constantinople, of course that being Gallipoli, in the beginning of the war had almost eliminated our prestige with the Mohammedan races. The wiping out of the French Republic could convey little to the Eastern races, whereas we could no doubt make terms with the enemy nations as a price for abandoning our allies that might well leave the empire not only intact, but actually increased in colonial extent. General Campion was not overpoweringly sentimental over the idea of abandonment of our allies. Remember, sentimentalism is Tietjens' affair, not Campion's. And that's where Tietjens is wrong on the strategy of the war. He has this ridiculously over-sentimental view of France as an 18th century body. They had won his respect as fighting organisations, and that to the professional soldier is a great deal, but still he was a professional soldier, and the prospect of widening the bounds of the British Empire could not be contemptuously dismissed at the price of rather sentimental dishonour. Such bargains had been struck before during wars involving many nations, and doubtless such bargains would be struck again. Campion continues in these ruminations. I go over some pages, just picking at the highlights. Civilian element in the government was so entirely indifferent to the sufferings of the men engaged in these operations and was so completely ignorant to what are military exigencies. The whole of military history, insofar as it concerned allied operations of any sort, from the campaigns of Xerxes and operations during the wars of the Greeks and Prussian operations of 1866 and 1870, Greeks and Romans to the campaigns of Marlborough, Napoleon, and the Prussian operations of 66 to 70, pointed to the conclusion that a relatively small force acting homogeneously was, to the nth power again, more effective than vastly superior forces of allies acting only imperfectly in accord or not in accord at all. Campion was then back into the affair he has to deal with, the O'Hara affair. Campion was pretty certain that O'Hara had made a drunken beast of himself. Yet he was very attached to O'Hara, one of the old type of rough diamond generals who swore your head off, but were damn capable men. It was a tremendous relief that Tietjens is basically falling on his sword. But he's sad to do it. I mean, he's Tietjens' godfather. He had idolised Tietjens' mother, who was a saint. Remember, that's often said. Tietjens takes after his mother in that saintliness. He thought of quartering himself on Groby. See, Campion also has the love of Groby, but easy to get Tietjens out of the army. He thought of quartering himself at Groby in Yorkshire during the war. That's how much he loved it. Just finding an excuse to do it. Been easy to get Tietjens out of the army, and they could all, Tietjens and Sylvia, live together. I mean, there's the Sylvia manipulation coming into Campion. See, he gets the Groby love. There is overlap between himself and Tietjens. There's the statistical imperial department bit of Tietjens which can get get Campion's idea of widening the bounds of empire and all of this, but Campion, having served in the East, Tietjens, of course, not having done any of this, has the Asiatic, Oriental, imperial grandeur, that flirtation, that romanticism. Tietjens doesn't have that. Tietjens has the home front. Tietjens has Sussex, Kent countrysides with one-up. Tietjens has Groby. Now, they both have Groby to a certain extent. That's why there's an interesting overlap, but no Asiatic dreams for Tietjens. And indeed, when he's going, page 464, Tietjens admits to Campion, you've got an admirable chance of India. But Campion comes back about this idea of spies. This is what Campion ultimately sends Tietjens to the front. Spies, right? Campion would have known about the Boer War. Page 466. Even after spying on Cop, he broke off and said, but those old memories won't interest you. I was called Butcher Campion in South Africa. And that's the idea that the Ford taps at here, is a lot of these generals would have seen action in the Boer War with, people called it the first concentration camps. There was internment in those wars. It turned nasty. It turned brutish. There was no easy peace to be had with the Boer. To be called Butcher, have your men follow you in spite of it, shows confidence and gives you as commander confidence. This element of Campion is completely absent from the show. What did that fellow think of when he reads Shakespeare, when all these heads, legs, arms joined together on the last day shall... how does it run? Henry V's address to his soldiers. Every subject's body is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own. And there is no king, be his cause ever so just. But of course Campion trails off. He doesn't quite get the lines as well as Tietjens would, perhaps. My God, my God. And he gets it out again. As can try it out with all the unspotted soldiers. You ever thought of that? An alarm came over Tietjens. The general was certainly in disorder. And then Campion gets to the point. Spies. The Boer War, spies and all this would have haunted Campion. Your confidential report states that you're suspected of having two great common interests with the French. That's what makes the whole position so impossible. I'll get Thurston to write something. And then there's this idea with his concept now that Campion believes he's sending Tietjens to his death. Tietjens agrees it as well. So they both look back at their childhood. Tietjens' childhood, where Campion was his godfather. Tietjens remembers, you made me read Clarendon's History of the Great Rebellion when I was 12. And they go, well, yes, that was great. There are finer things in Marvel than that. They reminisce. And a large part of what Tietjens has become is because of Campion. And then, of course, there's the twist of fate, really. They're not just sending Tietjens. They're sending McKechnie, because Campion wants the two geniuses, lunatics, to be together. He still thinks that's a good idea. Keep them all in one place. And they're sending Perron, because he has had enough. Campion has now had enough of Perron. And Tietjens realizes that, good God, I'm being sent up the line. He's sending me to Perry's army. Certain death. Campion goes, of course, no, this is a promotion. Take of it as a promotion, but we know. And so this is no more parades. We end to the final bit. And we get Tietjens' reflection on his meeting with Master at the bottom of page 470. Tietjens recognized the pathos of his trying to get away, his being Campion's, get away from the agonizing present moment. Back to an India where it was all real soldiering, good leather, and parades that had been parades. And this is actually done in the show, to be fair. Tietjens finally admits to Campion everything, that how horrible Sylvia's been. The Drake, the Perron affair, all of this. You might as well come out with it now. Sylvia thinks Drake was the father of his own son, and of course, Campion doesn't get it. He says, well, you should have divorced. You should have divorced. But Tietjens has said, well, what would an Anglican saint do? Now, there's a little bit here where you see, when Tietjens is explaining this to Campion, we get another indication of the child actually being Christopher's. Because, remember, Sylvia swims in presumption. Oh, I can add to the gossip here that Christopher is a socialist at the dinner table. And look what it does. It's terrible effects, but it's not true. There's nothing true about it. Tietjens is ensconced in knowledge. Think of his prediction of the war. because of looking at train timetables and army maneuver divisions. Christmas 1913. Tietjens is ensconced in knowledge. Tietjens is in the right. The sun is his, not Drake's. Anyway, there's an element that the front will at least rid himself of Sylvia. She saps his energy. That's the Venusberg effect. But there's a great transition on page 478. Now, think about where Christopher is going now, to the mud. The sticky mud of the trenches, where you're down in the earth, half buried. And juxtapose that with the image of, what's the famous image of home when you hit Great Britain coming up from the continent? It's of course those white cliffs. White, pure, clear, rising out of the sea, distinctive. There are complete opposites. And of course he has the fear of mud, the mud being the double meaning. The mud of the... the mud in England is in the relationships. It's in the gossip. It's in the treacherous home front. Whereas there's a clarity on the continent to the war, but you are literally surrounded by mud. Tietjens' mind missed the notch again. It was fear of the mud that was going to obsess him. But of course we've seen throughout this book that the mud has already been obsessing him. The mud. He had heard those words, standing amidst volcano craters of mud, amongst ravines, monstrosities of slime, cliffs, and distances all of slime. And Christopher realizes, perhaps the parade was now not worth it. Top of page 482. It's no good to have taken one's public school ethical system seriously. I am really, sir, the English public school boy. That's an 18th century product. What with the love of truth and that. God help me. They rammed it into me at Clifton in the belief of an Arnold forced upon Rugby that the vilest of sins, the vilest of all sins, is to peach to the headmaster. That's me, sir. Other men get over it after their schooling. I never have. I remain adolescent. These things are obsessions with me, complexes, sir. Now, there's an element of truth there, but of course, we've just had Sylvia describe to Perrone that Tietjens was the most grown-up man she's ever met. So, yes, he took his schooling seriously, and by so doing, actually grew up, whereas everyone else who didn't take it seriously has not matured to the same level of Tietjens. I place Tietjens in that Arnoldian pantheon. This is just the war being surrounded by at the end of the parade. Now, there is a parade to what Arnold's, Dr. Thomas Arnold, famous headmaster of rugby, there is a parade to what he wanted the English gentleman to be, no doubt. And this is the end of the parade, and that's why we have Tietjens have this admittance. But there's truth here to what Sylvia said, that she finds Tietjens the mature one, despite that. The parade can make you mature at times. All of this is what Ford's toying with. And of course, the two flanks of the modern come with him. McKechnie, the beastly little modern McKechnie, going on divorce, then not getting divorced. That's modernism. He comes with him to the front. Perrone, the pure decadence of the upper class, comes with him to the front. And then this, of course, the juxtaposition is that harmony is impossible in the modern age. Page 487. I say you regarded me as headmaster in 1912. Now I am your commanding officer, which is the same thing. This is Campion back to Tietjens. Back, he kind of gives him a retort for the rugby conversation. You must not peach to me. That's what you call the Arnold of rugby touch. What was the secret grief of your mother had in 1912? She died of it. She wrote to me just before her death. She said that she had great troubles, begged me to look after you, very specially. Why did she do that? He paused and meditated. He asked, how do you define Anglican sainthood? The other followers have canonizations, all ship-shape like Sandhurst examinations, but us Anglicans, I've heard 50 persons say your mother was a saint. She was, but why? Tejan said, it's the quality of harmony, sir. The quality of being in harmony with your own soul. God, having given you your own soul, you are then in harmony with heaven. Tejan was sentimentally at rest, still with wet eyes. He was walking near Salisbury in a grove, regarding long pastures and ploughlands running to dark high elms, from which, embowered was the word, peeped the spire of George Herbert's church. One ought to be a 17th century parson at the time of the Renaissance, of Anglican saintliness, who wrote perhaps poems. No, not poems, no, prose. The statelier vehicle. The men's voices had reminded him of church bells on a Sunday. Remember, he's going to hell. This is the last glimpses of the world in Tejan's mind as he heads to the front. He was sitting beside Mrs. Tejan's hammock, under the great cedar, at the corner of the stone house at Groby. The wind being from the east-northeast, the bells of Middlesbrough came to them faintly. Mrs. Tejan was 30, he himself 30. Tejan, the father, 35 or so. Most powerful, quiet man, a wonderful landowner, like his predecessors for generations. It was not from him that this fellow got his what? Was it mysticism? Another word. He himself home on leave from India, his head full of polo, talking for hours about the points and ponies with Tejan's father, who was a wonderful hand with a horse. But this fellow was much more wonderful. The father had committed suicide 5 years after. He had not spoken to the son's wife for 4 or 5 years. That takes us back to 1912. Then, when I strafed him in Rye, the wife was in France with Perrone. It's all gone. Mother, father, Groby. This fellow's down and out. And so we move in to Tejan's Inferno, in which he finds, in the midst of hell, that a man can stand up.